What if I told you that some of the most important decisions about your life are made in a room where you'll never be invited? While you're worrying about rent, inflation, or your job, there's a place where CEOs, central bankers, and world leaders gather to quietly decide the next move for the global economy. Not in public debates, not in your government, but behind closed doors in a small resort town hidden in the Swiss Alps. They call it the World Economic Forum, but to those who understand how power really works, it's something else entirely. Because here, policy becomes profit, warnings become opportunities, and conversations become consequences for billions. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Davos, the meetings they don't broadcast, the deals you were never meant to know, and the invisible hand that's been shaping your reality. But first, how does someone even get inside this room? Davos, a quiet ski town in the Swiss Alps, known for its snowy peaks and something far less visible. Every January, private jets begin filling the tiny regional airport. Helicopters land in sequence. Black cars with tinted windows line the icy roads. And behind layers of security, a very specific kind of guest list takes shape. Because getting into Davos isn't just about money, it's about access and influence. The World Economic Forum doesn't sell tickets like a regular conference. Attendance is by invitation only, and the invitations are reserved for a global elite. There's a reason they call it the most exclusive gathering on Earth. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, presidents and prime ministers, directors of central banks, heads of multinational organizations, and a carefully selected group of academics and media partners, whose role is more observational than participatory. But even among those invited, there's a hierarchy, because not all badges grant the same access. There's the standard participant badge, which allows you into the public panels, the ones live-streamed for the media, where world leaders deliver rehearsed speeches about climate change, innovation, or global cooperation. But then, there's the white badge and the coveted purple stripe. These are the credentials that unlock the real rooms, the private lounges, the closed-door sessions where no cameras are allowed and no transcripts are ever released. It's inside these rooms where CEOs discuss mergers, where central bankers hint at future interest rate moves, where government officials float policy ideas before they're even drafted back home. The price of entry? Officially, companies can pay over $250,000 per year for membership in the WEF's top tier. That doesn't include the cost of sending executives or the six-figure donations some firms quietly make to secure better visibility. But money is just one layer. The real currency here is power. Influence over markets, governments, and public opinion. And if you think that sounds dramatic, consider this. In 2023 alone, more than 50 heads of state attended. Over 600 CEOs, plus the leadership of the IMF, the World Bank, and major central banks from Europe and the United States. And while official WEF sessions are documented, what happens after hours isn't. The private dinners, the off-the-record briefings, the quiet side conversations in the hallways where billion-dollar decisions are often born. Critics have raised questions for years. How much influence does this group really have? How many market moves or policy shifts can be traced back to these informal discussions? Because when the same people controlling capital, regulations, and resources meet away from public scrutiny, patterns emerge. But here's the part most people miss. The real decisions aren't made on stage. They happen in the margins, in whispered conversations between people with the power to move entire economies. So who decides what gets discussed in these private rooms? And more importantly, how do those conversations shape the world outside? To understand that, we need to look at the decisions being made without a single vote cast. Outside, Davos looks like a harmless conference. Panel discussions, group photos, buzzwords like sustainability, innovation, global cooperation. But inside the private sessions, the conversations take a different tone. Here, policy doesn't need to pass through Congress. There's no opposition party, no public debate, just a room full of decision-makers quietly aligning on what comes next. One of the clearest examples, the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. In January 2008, just months before the collapse of Lehman Brothers, executives from major banks, officials from the Federal Reserve, and leaders from the European Central Bank all gathered in Davos. Behind closed doors, they discussed early signs of trouble in the U.S. housing market, liquidity concerns, banking system vulnerabilities. There were warnings, conversations about tightening credit, and still, when they returned home, the official message to the public remained calm. Weeks later, the global financial system began to unravel. And that wasn't the only time Davos discussions ran ahead of public knowledge. In 2020, during the height of pandemic uncertainty, the World Economic Forum introduced a concept that would spark global debate: the Great Reset. A proposal to reshape economies, reimagine capitalism, and redefine the role of governments and corporations in the post-pandemic world. To some, it sounded like necessary reform. To others, it raised alarms about centralized control over national policies by a group no citizen had ever voted for. Because that's the core issue here. Decisions with global impact being debated and shaped by people with zero electoral accountability. Environmental regulations that influence energy prices, trade frameworks that shift manufacturing jobs across borders, technological initiatives that determine how your data is used and stored. And all of it before a single lawmaker in your country even sees a proposal. Supporters argue that Davos is just a platform for dialogue, that it's a think tank, a space for exchanging ideas. But history shows what starts as a conversation in Davos often ends as legislation, market shifts, or economic policy. And when you follow the timeline, when you overlay the Davos discussions with market and policy moves months later, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. So the question isn't whether decisions are made here, but how quickly those private conversations translate into public reality. And that brings us to something even more unsettling. How do these quiet meetings trigger sudden movements in global markets? The financial markets move on information, on whispers, on signals, on patterns only a few are trained to see. And Davos has become one of the most watched and most carefully decoded signals of the year. Because while the public focuses on the speeches, the real players watch the body language, the offhand comments, the private briefings that never make it to the live stream. For traders and hedge funds, Davos is more than a conference. It's a predictive tool. A study by Bloomberg tracked the performance of companies whose CTOs attended Davos. The result? A measurable bump in their stock prices in the weeks following the event. Because attendance itself sends a signal about access to information and proximity to decision makers. When a central bank governor drops a casual remark in a private breakfast, or when a CEO hints at expansion plans over cocktails, that information ripples through trading floors worldwide. One investment manager once put it bluntly, "What's said in Davos, we price in minutes later." It's not just equities, commodity markets, currencies, Even government bonds can react to the mood that emerges from these alpine meetings. Sometimes it's subtle, a shift in tone from a finance minister, a guarded answer from a central banker. Other times, it's direct. In 2013, then ECB President Mario Draghi used Davos to hint at continued monetary support for struggling European economies. The euro surged, bond yields shifted, and billions of dollars moved, all before any official policy announcement. Because in Davos, the line between observation and action is razor thin. And here's the part that makes it almost impossible to track. The most market-moving conversations don't happen on stage. They happen in corridors, private dinners, and invitation-only side sessions with no transcripts and no recordings. It's a loop of influence, where those with the power to move the markets are surrounded by those with the power to profit from those moves. And while regulators focus on insider trading within companies, the larger global flow of privileged information remains largely unchecked. But market signals are only part of the story. Because what's discussed in Davos doesn't just move prices, it shapes the very policies that govern how those markets work. And that leads us straight into the next layer of control, the information gap between what's said inside those rooms and what the rest of the world is allowed to hear. From the outside, Davos appears transparent. Live-streamed panels, press releases, social media posts showing world leaders shaking hands, smiling for the cameras. But that's only the surface, because for every session broadcast to the world, dozens more happen behind closed doors. No cameras, no journalists, no public records. The World Economic Forum's public agenda is carefully curated. Themes like climate change, sustainability, digital transformation. But behind that polished facade, private sessions take place under a strict rule, Chatham House rule, meaning participants are free to use the information received, but they cannot reveal the identity or affiliation of the speaker, or of anyone else in the room. In simple terms, the world gets the message, but never the source. This rule is designed to encourage open dialogue, to let CEOs speak candidly, to allow central bankers to hint at future policies without fear of public backlash. But the side effect? A communication gap, where critical economic insights stay confined to those already in power. Take, for example, the informal gatherings of World Economic Leaders, or IGEWLs. These are the most exclusive, invite-only discussions at Davos. Small groups, no media allowed, no public disclosure, just CEOs, central bankers, and political leaders discussing issues that could reshape global markets. And while the public watches a live-streamed speech about building resilient economies, in a private chalet nearby, the same leaders might be negotiating trade deals, discussing monetary tightening, or outlining coordinated strategies for upcoming regulatory changes. These aren't conspiracy theories, they're documented facts. The WEF itself openly describes IGEWLs on its website, but the contents of those meetings remain off-limits. And it's not just IGEWLs. Private dinners hosted by multinational banks, breakfast roundtables organized by consulting giants, closed-door panels where regulators meet with the CEOs they're supposed to oversee, all happening in the same small town, within the same 4 days, year after year. Even journalists who attend Davos face limitations. Access to private sessions is almost always denied. Reporters are kept at designated media zones, allowed only to cover the public agenda. And when leaks do happen, they're rare, fragmented, and often quickly dismissed. One leaked account from a past Davos session described central bankers discussing interest rate paths months before public announcements. Another referenced oil executives privately debating production cuts while publicly calling for market stability. But by the time the public learns anything concrete, the trades have already been made, the policies already shaped, the narratives already set. This isn't about illegal behavior, it's about information asymmetry, where those inside the room trade in knowledge before the rest of the world even knows there's something to pay attention to. And this gap isn't closing. If anything, it's growing wider, because the complexity of global markets and the concentration of decision-making power make Davos more relevant than ever for those looking to stay ahead of the next economic shift. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. What happens when warnings, raised inside those private rooms, are ignored by the very system meant to protect us? For all the secrecy, all the closed doors, not everything discussed in Davos stays hidden. Sometimes, the most important warnings are spoken out loud, on record, in front of cameras, and yet they're still ignored. In January 2006, at the height of a global economic boom, a select group of economists and financial leaders at Davos raised concerns about the U.S. housing market. They spoke about excessive leverage, unsustainable credit expansion, and the growing risk of a systemic collapse. Warnings that, in hindsight, sound almost prophetic. But back then, markets were euphoric, governments were focused on growth, and the dominant narrative was optimism. By the end of 2008, the world was deep in the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Millions lost their homes, entire banks vanished overnight, and trillions of dollars in wealth evaporated. The pattern didn't stop there. In 2019, just months before the pandemic, health experts at Davos raised red flags about global preparedness for infectious disease outbreaks. They warned of weak supply chains, lack of coordination between nations, and vulnerabilities in healthcare systems. Weeks later, COVID-19 spread across the world, catching governments completely unprepared. Even in 2023, amid global inflation and rising interest rates, Davos panels featured repeated warnings about recession risks, energy supply shocks, and geopolitical instability. Yet as soon as the event ended, stock markets rallied, risk appetite returned, and the collective memory seemed to reset. Because that's the paradox of Davos, a place where some of the world's smartest people gather to diagnose the biggest risks facing humanity, only to watch those warnings fade under the weight of short-term profits, political agendas, and market optimism. It's not that the signals aren't there. They're documented, recorded, archived. The problem is that decision-makers, both inside and outside Davos, often choose to look the other way until the crisis arrives, and by then, the damage is done. For those inside the room, a warning is just another data point. For those outside, it's a headline, easily forgotten. And when the next disruption comes, the cycle repeats. The same faces return to Davos, the same discussions happen under the same rules of limited transparency and selective disclosure. So the real question isn't just what's being said in Davos, but whether anyone, anywhere, will actually act before it's too late. Because while the world keeps reacting, there's one group that never stops preparing. And that brings us to the truth that lingers behind every handshake, every speech, and every closed-door meeting in Davos.
By the time you watch this, the next Davos guest list is already being finalized. private flights booked, security details arranged, agendas drafted behind encrypted emails. In a few months, the same corridors will fill with the same faces. Whispers will circulate. Decisions will crystallize long before the public ever knows. You'll hear about the speeches, you'll see the headlines, but the real moves will happen in rooms you'll never enter, conversations you'll never hear, because that's how the system works. Visibility is a performance, access is a privilege, and power operates in silence. While you scroll through news feeds trying to decode the next market shift, there are people already acting on information you'll never receive. The truth is, you're not supposed to know. Not until it's too late. Not until the deals are signed, the policies announced, and the market already moved. So next time you see footage from Davos, remember, what they show you isn't the story. It's the cover story. Because the most powerful decisions are the ones you'll never see being made.